Good evening, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Nate, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Gretchen and JM. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing good.
Yeah, pretty well. We were in the middle of a heat wave now, so it's a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit wet out there, but it's okay. It's been a pretty good week for the most part here, and just enjoying a little bit of the summertime and lots of reading and hanging out with a girlfriend and, all that good stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, there was recently a book sale that was happening in my area, so I was able to go there and check out some stuff, even though I probably shouldn't, since I have so many unread things around here already.
Got anything good?
Yeah, I got a couple of short story collections from authors I wanted to check out. One author I've already read some from before, Jhumpa Lahiri, and then there were some others that I had heard of, but I hadn't tried anything out by them yet, so I was able to pick some of those up to see what they were like.
Oh, very cool.
Sounds like a really cool sale was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of stuff. Yeah, there was a bookstore that just opened up a little bit away from my house, just a few minutes walk, so they have a lot of used books. There's some new stuff, too. I did end up going there a while ago and picking up a bunch of cool stuff, including The Master and Margarita, which is by an author that we're doing tonight.
Yes.
I actually used to have a copy, and I lent it out to somebody, and I never got it back. So this is a different translation. So, yeah, but I'm happy to have that on my shelf again, I guess. So.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic book. Definitely one of the masterpieces of the 20th century, and we'll certainly be getting into his other fiction later tonight.
Yes.
But I could say the heat wave has definitely been hitting me pretty hard down here, too. The weather has been incredibly strange tonight, so it's a nice, strange summary mood for these strange stories we'll be looking at tonight.
Yeah, I would say so. What's our theme tonight? I would say it's brains.
Yes, the brain. The most complicated structure known to man to exist in the universe. So before we get into tonight's stories, you can find us on every major podcast platform, Apple, Spotify, Anchor. You can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Chrononautspodcast. We're on Twitter at ChrononautsSF, and you can read several stories, including original translations of works, including one we're going to be doing tonight on our blogspot, which is chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. And you can also send us an email at chrononautspodcast@gmail.com. So with that out of the way, our understanding of the brain goes back quite a ways. For this segment, we're going to be drawing from the 95th volume of the Handbook of Clinical Neurology series, namely the History of Neurology textbook. And this is an enormous book, about 1,000 pages long, and each of its 55 chapters contains dozens and dozens of references. So not only do you have a huge text that goes into all the detail you could possibly want about the history of the subject, you have a huge list of papers for further reading if you feel like branching out even further. So this is just going to be a very cursory sketch, or maybe a brief probe of the frontal lobe, if you will. It happens that trepanation is the oldest documented surgery performed on humans, dating back 5,000 years, though not necessarily that it's the oldest surgery, but rather it leaves quite a strong impression on the body. Ancient trepanation was only discovered in the 1860s. An American diplomat named Ephraim George Squeer had been given a skull from a Peruvian cemetery with a curious hole in it. He brought it to the New York Academy of Medicine in 1865, and based on the marks and shape of the hole, they concluded that it could have only been made by humans. And this was further confirmed and commented on by Paul Broca in 1867, which opened up a new field of archaeology. Not much is known about why these surgeries were taking place, but they were apparently quite common among certain Neolithic cultures all over the world. Broca theorized that these ancient cultures treated some neurological disorders, framing it in supernatural terms, providing a hole for the demons in one's head to escape, though Broca's contemporary anthropologists were not at all sold on the supernatural angle. Jumping forward a bit to when humanity developed writing, quite early on we see references to neurology in the ancient medical texts from Mesopotamia, the oldest of which is from around 2000 BC. These are broken down into diagnostic texts and therapeutic texts. Oxford has quite a few snippets of these posted. Apparently the cause of illness, "He was struck by a ghost wandering at night," was common enough where they had to carve it into stone. But quite a few neurological conditions are described: strokes, head and spinal trauma, and treatment was often herbal and spiritual. Likewise, Egyptian medicine was a mixture of herbal and spiritual techniques, though less is known as fewer papyrus survive, but it is known that they had a separate word for the brain, and that one anonymous scribe even commented that the living brain pulsates. The text also has an interesting chapter on neurology in the Bible and the Talmud, and across the Mediterranean, in particular Pythagoras, theorized that the earth and everything on it, including people, was made out of the elements water, earth, air, and fire. This formed the basis for Greco-Roman medicine as pioneered by Hippocrates, born somewhere around 460 BC, who on the brain stated, quote, "I hold that the brain is the most powerful organ of the human body, for when it is healthy, it is an interpreter to us of the phenomenon caused by air, as it is the air that gives us intelligence. Eyes, ears, tongue, hand, and feet act in accordance with the discernment of the brain. Wherefore, I assert that the brain is the interpreter of consciousness." About 50 years after Hippocrates' death, systematic dissection of humans begins, which ushers in a brief new era of medical research and discoveries, especially true of the Hellenistic world in Alexandria, though post-Aristotle these discoveries slowed down quite a bit, as the Aristotelian viewpoint was not that consciousness lies in the brain, but in the heart. A few centuries later, Galen, who lived from 129 to 210 AD, and made a great deal of medical advancements and discoveries, in particular formulated several theories on the brain from dissecting Barbary apes, which he felt were close enough to human brains to work with and make meaningful observations from. In particular, he rejected Aristotle, calling his viewpoint on the heart absurd. After the Western Roman Empire collapses, key texts from Galen are preserved by the Byzantine and Islamic empires, which in particular are expanded upon in the Arabic world through encyclopedias and compendiums and such. Like with everything else at this time, Europe is a dark age, and there isn't any advancements happening there until the late Renaissance and Enlightenment era. Several key texts from Carolus Piso in the early 1600s that through autopsies explained epilepsy, migraine, and brain diseases were published. Dye injections of cerebral vessels was pioneered by Johann Jakob Wipfer in 1658, and the first monograph dedicated to the brain was Anatomy of the Brain, followed by The Description and Use of the Nerves by Thomas Willis in 1664, considered to be the founder of neurology. In a return of the friend from the podcast, Emanuel Swedenborg is generally credited to be the first person to theorize a function localization of the brain, that is, each part of the brain does something different, which he wrote about in the 1740s. However, Swedenborg's writings on medicine were largely ignored by his contemporaries and eventually rediscovered in the 1880s, but it still makes for a rather interesting footnote. A major player in brain localization who was taken seriously was the aforementioned Paul Broca, who takes us back to the beginning of the story with drilling holes into our heads. I think we'll stop there, but if you're interested in reading more about this stuff, please do check out this book. It's absurdly thoroughly detailed, and especially when you get past the Renaissance, chronicling the history of every neurological condition through the centuries. We'll just note that the rapid pace of advancements in medicine made in the late 1800s parallels the advancements in chemistry, physics, electricity, and so on, and that by the time that tonight's stories are published, roughly a period of 50 years between 1885 and 1935, the foundations for the modern understanding of the brain had been laid, though certainly we're quite far off from what we know today. And even that is quite far off from a total mastery and understanding of what is the most complicated structure known to man in the universe.
So before we begin, I would just like to apologize for possibly butchering a number of Russian names during this
I still
talk.
do it too, and I've studied Russian for hundreds of hours, so don't worry about it.
Yeah. I think that I've got a good handle on a lot of it, but anyway, I'll do my best to go through everything in the background of our first author, who is the legendary Mikhail Bulgakov. And Bulgakov is a very well-known author today, especially for his book, The Master and Margarita, which is recognized as a classic pretty much all over the world.
Yep.
He was born in 1891 in the city of Kiev, in Ukraine, which has been sort of disputed territory for a long time, but...
Well, it was one of those places that was part of the Russian Empire forever,
Right.
and then it was part of the Soviet Union for the entirety of the
time,
Soviet
yeah.
Union, and just broke off after the Soviet Union collapsed, and now there's been the whole mess since, which is an unfortunate situation, to say the least.
Yes, so this is slightly important to our discussion because Bulgakov is he may appear to an extent to be a somewhat contradictory figure. He pretty much is an anti-communist writer writing in Soviet Russia, which is not a very safe position to be in. He's also an anti-Ukrainian nationalist. His family all spoke Russian. He did not even know the Ukrainian language, and he essentially believed that his people were Russians and that they should be considered Russians.
And that's a common viewpoint held still till this day. I think things have changed a lot since the last 10 or 15 years or so, but I know around the time that the Soviet Union broke up, a lot of people living in Ukraine didn't speak Ukrainian. Russia was, and still is in many parts, the lingua franca, if you will.
I know a few Ukrainians who live around here, and they seem to alternately sort of consider themselves Russian and Ukrainian, and it's always been a slight point of confusion for me sometimes, but I'm sure other people have lots of opinions about that, and it's not really something I wanted to really get into because I don't know enough about the subject. However, It is important because, first of all, the fact that gets mostly ignored, I guess, or swept under the rug, is that after the revolution happened in 1917, there was a pretty bloody and pretty horrible civil war within the borders of the Russian Empire, and Ukraine was specifically affected by this very much. And there were essentially the Bolsheviks, who were known as the Reds, and I guess they called them the Menshevik force, the White Guard.
Yeah, right. They're both derived from, the Bolshevik is like greater and Menshevik is lesser.
Yeah. So one of his first published works was a play that he had written based on a novel that he was sort of struggling to get published. It had been serialized, but it took a while for it to become an actual book, which seems to be sort of a pattern with him. But this play was called The Days of the Turbans, and it was based on his book, The White Guard, which was about the experiences of a family during the Civil War period. And it's a very contentious play to this day. And apparently, Stalin was a really big fan of this play, and this play was actually, even though it was considered sort of anti-Bolshevik, it was pro-Russian, and that's how it was considered. And so it didn't win him too many friends around his home territory for a while there, and still doesn't, in fact. So before he really became fully immersed in writing, Bulgakov was a doctor, and he had an interest in the theater already. He had written many childhood plays. He was one of the oldest of 7 children, and he would write plays for the family to perform. Sounds pretty charming, really. But he did train as a doctor at a very young age, entering the University of Kiev. And first he joined the Red Cross and went to the front during the opening parts of the First World War. And it was there that he suffered some pretty serious injury.
It's not surprising. That whole military operation was a complete disaster.
Yeah. Due to his chronic pain, as a result of the injuries, he developed a morphine addiction, which lasted pretty well up till the end of that wartime period. And he wrote about this in a apparently somewhat fantastic-seeming novella called Morphine, and that's kind of his experiences and how he managed to break the habit.
Yeah, I haven't read that one.
When he was discharged, it was getting close to the time when the revolution would break out in 1917. He had a medical practice at home, and he was actually known for treating venereal diseases and made a lot of discoveries specifically related to syphilis. During the Civil War, he was recruited by several different governments because apparently there was a great number of coups around this time, and they just kept, they're like, well, we need doctors. And he was sent to some of the provinces, Smolensk, I believe, and it was a pretty rough life. He wrote about this in various stories, which he ended up sending to newspapers, some of which were published in Germany. And his eventual goal was to combine this into a work which he called The Young Doctor's Notebook, which eventually did get published, but like much of his other stuff, wasn't until the 1960s. So while this was happening, unfortunately, he contracted typhus. And it was during this time that some of his family members, through their connections, were able to emigrate to France and Germany, like a good number of expatriates who were not in favor of the revolution. Mikhail himself was refused permission to leave because of his infection. And this was actually the last time that he saw most of his family. So it's pretty sad because, the restrictions on leaving the country were already well in place by the 1920s. And unfortunately, for Mikhail, he seemed to always be frank and always speak his mind in his writings and in his personal doings. And as a result, he was never really in good standing with the party, even though once he did start to write plays, some of them met with favor, including from Stalin himself, who supposedly went to see The Days of the Turbans something like 20 times. So he was a big fan of this play. Unfortunately, though, as the 1920s wore on, things started to get stricter, and he kept running up against censorship. And his plays would be banned before they were even produced. Eventually, things got so desperate for him that he ended up writing a letter to Stalin himself. And when he didn't get a reply from that, he sent another one, this time to the government of the USSR. And this letter seems like it was very desperate and very kind of candid, and like he was kind of losing it a little bit. And he just said, you know what, I don't care. I'm just going to say what I think. And among other things, he wrote, "After all my works had been banned, among the many citizens to whom I am known as a writer, voices began to be raised, all offering me the same advice: to write a communist play, and in addition, to send the government of the USSR a letter of repentance, containing a renunciation of the views which I have expressed earlier in my literary works, and assurances from now onwards I will work as a fellow traveling writer, devoted to the idea of communism. The aim? To save myself from persecution, poverty, and inevitable ruin. I have not taken this advice. It is unlikely that I could have presented myself to the government of the USSR in a favorable light by writing a false letter, which was both an unprincipled and naive political stratagem. I have not even attempted to write a communist play, knowing full well that I would not be able to do so. The growing desire to put an end to my sufferings as a writer compels me to address an honest letter to the government of the USSR." And he goes on to say, "It is my duty as a writer to fight against censorship, whatever form it may take, and under whatever regime, just as it is to urge the freedom of the press. I am an ardent admirer of this freedom, and believe that any writer who tries to argue that he does not need it is like a fish announcing publicly that it has no need of water." So, by this time, he had quit being a doctor after the whole typhus thing happened. I guess it was just sort of like Arthur Conan Doyle. He just decided it wasn't for him. And another parallel, of course, to one of our previous writers is like our old friend C.S. Lewis. Both of Mikhail's grandfathers were theologians, and his father was actually a theology teacher in an academy. So he had a quite religious upbringing, and although he stopped short of calling himself a religious person in this letter, he said that he was a mystical writer, and he put that in all capital letters. So it's obviously very important to him.
Yeah, and you can definitely see elements of his background and his profession and his conduct in general come out in Heart of a Dog.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which I think is probably a common theme. Well, at least for the ones I've read between that one and Master and Margarita anyway.
So I'm going to continue reading some of this letter because I think it's pretty poignant. He goes on to call Russia a backward country. And he says that only the intelligentsia and the nobility could have saved this country. Then he says, not only my past works have perished, but my present and future ones. I personally, with my own hands, threw into the stove the draft of a novel about the devil, the draft of a comedy, and the beginning of my second novel, The Theater. All my things are hopeless. I request the Soviet government to take into account that I am not a political activist, but a writer, that I have given all the fruits of my labors to the Soviet stage. I ask it to be taken into account that for me, not being allowed to write is tantamount to being buried alive. I appeal to the humanity of Soviet power and request that I, a writer who cannot be of use in his native land, be magnanimously permitted to leave. If what I have written is not convincing, and I am condemned to a lifetime of silence in the USSR, I request the Soviet government to give me work in my special field and find me a permanent post as a stage director in a theater. I offer the USSR in complete honesty, without the slightest intention to commit sabotage, a specialist director and actor who undertakes to put on any play to the best of his ability, from Shakespeare right up to the plays of the present day. If I am not appointed a director, I ask to be given a permanent post as an extra. If I can't be an extra, I ask for a job as a stagehand. If this is impossible, I request the Soviet government to do with me what it finds fit, but to do something, because I, a dramatist who has written 5 plays and is known in the USSR and abroad, am, at the present moment, faced with poverty, the street, and ruin. Well, after 2 months, Mikhail got a call, and that call was from Kopa, the Dread, Stalin himself. Stalin taunted him somewhat and said, "Are you sick of us? Should we let you leave?" And Mikhail, who I kind of imagine was shaking in his boots at this point, pretty much said, "Well, I've given it some thought, and I've decided that I think that a Russian writer cannot really live outside of his homeland." And Stalin said, "Yes, you're right. That's what I think too. Where do you want to work?" So, the solution was the Moscow Art Theater. Mikhail was not to be a director, but a director's assistant. So, from that point on, it was considered that Mikhail Bulgakov had a special relationship of sorts with Stalin. And, in a way, Stalin was his protector. His friends and colleagues said that they believed that it was only this that saved him from execution or imprisonment. And that may well be true, because during the 1930s, Mikhail did not change his viewpoints about the communist state.
And certainly the man calling all the shots there was Stalin. So if you're in his good graces, that does give you pretty good protection.
Yes, yes. He still could not get any of his books published. And increasingly, after a brief renaissance, he found that he could still not get the plays produced. Days of the Turbans continued to be popular and was put back on the repertory. And he joined the Bolshoi Theater as a librettist and did many adaptations of famous novels like Dead Souls. But he could see that they were not interested in his own work, and this was very disillusioning. So one thing that Mikhail did do, even though he was unable to publish his work, is that he had his own sort of literary salons where he would invite people to his apartment, and he and his wife would play hosts, and they would serve dinner, and he would read to them. And he would read to them works like The Heart of a Dog and The Master and Margarita. Now, we're doing the book The Heart of a Dog today, or Dog's Heart as I kind of prefer to call it, although it's traditionally been called The Heart of a Dog in English.
Yeah, that's 2 words in Russian. Either translation is fine. There's really no word for of in Russian in that context. They use a different grammatical case.
Yeah. A dog's heart has more of a... It sounds better somehow.
Yeah.
So during the time when this book was written, writers, they had to earn a license from the state in order to essentially make a living at their profession. And they also had to pay a certain amount of money every 6 months. And they were considered one of the free professions, which meant they were heavily taxed. Now, this was during a brief period in the 1920s called the New Economic Policy. And according to this policy, certain workers who produced goods could sell some of these goods for their own personal gain rather than giving everything to the state. This policy did not last forever, and by the end of the 30s, it was not in place anymore. But so during this time, it was more relaxed than it would be later, but it was still bad enough. And Mikhail had this manuscript confiscated because he did read it aloud, and one of the guests at his home at that time was an informant. So his apartment was searched, and many manuscripts were taken. In 1930, this one and several others were returned to him. I believe that the popular writer Maxim Gorky interceded on his behalf, actually. Now, this story is one of 3 that was originally submitted to an almanac paper, whose name I had written down, but I can't remember. But there were 3 stories. One was The Fatal Eggs, then there was this one, and then there was Diaboliad. And all 3 of these stories can be considered science fiction or science fiction adjacent. Especially The Fatal Eggs, which I have not read, but the plot outline certainly makes me think of H.G. Wells, especially Food of the Gods.
Yeah. Was there an H.G. Wells reference in the novel? Because there was in the movie, so I'm kind of wondering...
I don't think so, but apparently the film does reference a lot of other Bulgakov works. So that might have been thrown in deliberately for that reason.
Yeah,
he did say that he was influenced by Wells around this time. So
yeah, Wells had pretty big readership in Russia, and I think was generally read there by a lot of these blossoming Soviet science fiction writers. I mean, we haven't really covered a Russian author. Well, I mean, we did that non-fiction-y weird one in the mathematics episode, but we really haven't looked at anything Russian since like early on in the podcast. And there's a whole new wave and I guess resurgence of these science fiction-y stories that come out around this time, including more stuff in the 20s that is explicitly science fiction.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll be doing one from the very same time, very same year, in fact, next episode.
And there's certainly a lot of other stuff coming up too, so definitely expect some more Soviet content on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, and obviously he made a reference in that letter to the novel about the devil, which was The Master and Margarita. So, like his sort of literary Ukrainian antecedent Gogol, he was prone to burning his own work when he thought that something wasn't right or he couldn't do anything with it. And he said that his hopes for Margarita were not good. And even though he read this aloud, and apparently the whole audience was stunned. And he said, possibly jokingly, he said, well, tomorrow I'm going to walk over to the publishers and deliver this manuscript. And was met with complete and utter silence. Everybody was just, they didn't know what to do, what to say. if you read Master and Margarita, you can definitely see why.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much, and particularly the Soviet Writers' Union, which Bulgakov himself was not admitted to until 1934, is heavily, heavily satirized in that book. Just the whole idea of a writers' union and how it was tied in with the Soviet state at the time probably was somewhat repellent to him. But if you weren't part of the writers' union, obviously, good luck, right? But I'm just going to read a little something written by a Soviet politician and economist and writer named Nikolai Bukharin. And this is what he had to say about artists. Lest you think that the invention of a writers' union is pretty harmless, even this person was executed, by the way.
Yeah, the late 30s were a pretty crazy time
Yeah.
in Stalinist Soviet Union and didn't really let up until his death.
No, it's pretty insane. So this is what Nikolai Bukharin had to say. And he was talking about the idea of a free writer, or he was talking about creative freedom in general. He said, that will never happen. We need the cadres of the intelligentsia to be trained in a particular way. Yes, we shall impress our stamps on intellectuals. We shall produce them as in a factory. And obviously, Bulgakov, as a sort of a traditionalist and as somebody who values frankness, and this is something, a characteristic that Stalin himself apparently greatly admired. So we have a series of contradictions here. No wonder people had so much trouble figuring out what to do and what to say. A Dog's Heart, Sobach Bisertsi, or maybe, was written in 1925 and published in 1968 in English under the Michael Glenny translation, but not until 1987 in Russia, officially, though bootlegs apparently circulated. It was declared unpublishable by party examiner Lev Kamenev, and the play he wrote the following year, based on the book, was also cancelled. This not long after his home was searched and the manuscript seized. So, I had read this book before, and this reading was very different for me. I definitely was very much casual about it the first time, and not so much so this time. So what did everybody think of this book?
Yeah, I like this one a lot. This was my first time reading it. I had read Master and Margarita a really long time ago, so I expected this to be good, but I definitely really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. I did too, and this is the first time I've read it, and also the first work by Bulgakov that I have read. As my first exposure to him, I did really enjoy this work.
It's interesting with the translation issues, as there seem to be several variations in the original Russian text. I read this one side by side with the Boyas translation. I believe she's also done other translations of stuff around this time, like she did the one of Professor Dowell's Head that we have lined up for next month. But I don't know, he's an author that's kind of hard to translate and bring in like his flow and rhythm of sentences and stuff, and Russian in general is more distant from English than like Spanish or a French or something like that. So
Yeah.
I get that it is hard to do that with Russian, but looking at the differences between the Boyas and the Glenny translation, I don't know, I feel like they both miss a little bit of the original text with the way he phrases things and his meter and stuff like that.
So there's also another translation, which I only found in an audiobook version, Michael Kapelsen. And that one was different again. So
Yeah, right.
I really can't say which is better. I listened to some of the audiobook. I mostly read the book, but I listened to the beginning. And definitely, if you want to check out this book before listening to the podcast and just listen to it really quickly, I do recommend the audiobook because the reader, whose name is, I can't remember. I think it's also Michael something. He really gets into it.
Michaels.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, he really gets into it, especially the dog point of view chapters at the beginning. Quite entertaining. And I have to say, I mean, I mostly remembered, I guess I remembered the book being more lighthearted than it actually is. I mean, there are certainly a lot of funny parts, and the dog point of view chapters are pretty adorable, I guess. But the book is a little heavier than I remembered, and it actually got more so as it went on, to the point where I actually found the last chapter kind of difficult to finish. Like, it took longer than the rest of the book for me to read that last chapter.
Yeah.
I think because I knew it was going to happen. And I don't know, this is a little different than like something along the lines of The House on the Borderland that we did last time, where it's all a whole lot of incidents. I think this book is a lot shorter, but it's also less about the things that happen and more about the feeling of it and more about the way you react to it and also the humor.
Yeah, it seems to satirize pretty much everybody in Soviet society. I mean, not just the communists, but the
professor.
Old guard czarist, too.
Yeah, so that's something that the translator in her introduction, she seems to fall very much on the side that Bulgakov is sort of unerringly on the side of the professor, and that we're supposed to really identify with him. At least that was kind of the impression that I got from the way she wrote it.
And that's the impression I got from the book, especially after you reading the intro segment there. But I think he does a great deal of poking fun at himself and his peers, and I think he does raise some interesting points there that do kind of lambast the old way of thinking, which we'll get into when we do the plot summary. But I don't think he's very one-sided in who he's satirizing here.
No, he's not completely, and I actually was quite upset with the professor for much of this. So, as usual, I'm going to say I would like people to read this if they haven't. This one is not really about spoilers so much. I think there's not really anything to spoil. I think you can sort of tell where things are going, and it's not really like there's any crazy twists or anything weird that throws you for a loop. It's really not about that. It's not that kind of book. I mean, obviously, we can't comment too specifically on the prose style since it is a translated work, but Nate, I know you read some of the original Russian, so...
Yeah, so about the translations, I looked at the Glynny and the Boyas. The Boyas is the one I read for most of it. Yeah. I just looked at them for comparisons between the two and the original, and the Boyas is definitely closer to the original Russian than the Glynny is. The Glynny has a lot of Britishisms in it.
The Glynny is the one that I had read before.
Yeah, and that is the first one that was published, so I mean, it's probably one of the more common ones out there. And it's not a bad translation of it. You just kind of keep those things in mind. I would like to check out that other translation that the audiobook is, because when you were talking about it, it seemed like it was translated from a different version of the Russian text than both the Boyas and the Glynny were.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the things that you mentioned were missing or were in that audiobook translation.
Right. So, yeah, that's another annoying issue with this text is I don't think we are able to find any definitive list of like how many versions of this text are there actually out there. But there's definitely more than one in Russian, which complicates things. But I guess if you're looking for an edition to try in English, I can certainly recommend the Boyas. It's not 100% perfect, but it's certainly more than readable, and it does, for the most part, capture the spirit of the original.
So, Gretchen, this is your first Bulgakov, and you'll be reading more?
Yes, I do want to check out The Master and Margarita at some point, but I also read the Boyas. That was the version that I went with. Even though I know that the Glynny is the original version, I wanted to read the other one first. And I did try to check on some of the sites where I find books to see if I could find any other translations, but I just found like multiple editions of the Glynny.
Yeah. I know there's at least that one other one. I'm sure there's some other ones too, but yeah, quite a lot of stuff out there.
I don't know for sure about this one. This book is very popular in Russia. It's his second most popular after Margarita, which is popular everywhere, but it's immensely popular in Russia. Master and Margarita is taught in school there. Maybe university students might study it here, possibly in certain courses, but certainly never heard of a high school student actually having to study that book.
Oh, no, that'd be way above a U.S. high school student.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, possibly, but it could also be a regional thing. It's just so important. It's considered very important, I guess. And like one thing I neglected to mention is there are like a couple of Bulgakov museums, one in Moscow and one in Kiev, and they actually do full tours of the locations of mentioned in Margarita, and they even have like people dressed up as the characters and stuff like that. So it's a pretty big deal. Like it's serious.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think that this book. I mean, not because it's shorter. I mean, I obviously have no predilections against short work, but I don't think this is quite as good as Margarita.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, Margarita is one of the best novels of the 20th century, so I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to compare oneself to. I mean, this is still a great novel, and certainly one of the best things we've read on the podcast.
This is an earlier work, too, and I think Margarita is very, very personal. It just feels really redolent with emotion and personal struggle, I guess, in a way. And the humor is still there. Oh, it's a very funny book at times, too. But let's stop talking about Master and Margarita, because that's a different book that we probably won't do on the podcast.
No, I don't think so.
No, but this is very, very much SF adjacent. And besides these two books, I've also read Diaboliad, which is kind of random. But those are the only Bulgakov I've read until now. Definitely going to be reading The Fatal Eggs at some point. And maybe some of the other stuff, like that story, Morphine.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can't get some of them on the show.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to read them for my own, but also maybe Fatal Eggs we could do here at some point, because it seems like a pretty cool story.
Yeah, that was one of the first of Bulgakov I had heard of, because I had an app that had like a bunch of different free stories and stuff on it. And that was on there, but I never had the chance to read it.
So, a homeless street dog tells us of his wandering on the Moscow streets. It's a hard, cold life, filled with hunger and pain. And as the story starts, he's had scalding hot water dumped on him for rooting around in the garbage of the Central Economic Council's canteen. So there's all sorts of neat dog perspective detail in these opening chapters about Moscow life, the people, their diets, not very good, and how you can tell what kind of person you're facing by the way their eyes look. The dog is lured in by a gentleman who gives him sausage and commands his respect. The man takes him home. Sharik, the dog, the furball, can tell he works at the hospital, and his name is Filip Filipovich. He is a professor, Professor Preobrazhensky, and he also runs a clinic from his apartments, which he shares with two female servants. He also has a student apprentice, Dr. Bormenthal, who spends most of his time there, and later on he actually lives on the premises. This Bormenthal has to subdue Sharik, who needs to get patched up, and panics at the medical sights and smells. From this time forward, Bormenthal is known as the Bitten One, and he and Sharik and the person Sharik becomes have a somewhat antagonistic relationship through the rest of the novel. The professor is doing rejuvenative transplants. For a high price, he has new ovaries from an ape implanted inside a woman. He also does other discreet services, especially for important party-connected families, including abortions, I think. The new management committee of his building come in, led by a man named Svonder, and they seem to expect respect, but he gives them none at all. And of course, Sharik is encouraged. The professor refuses to give up 2 of his 7 rooms for resettlement, and won't even buy magazines for the benefit of the children of France. And here I found a quote from Vladimir Lenin, which kind of seems relevant, and he said, "A rich man's flat is one in which the number of rooms is equal to or exceeds the number of persons permanently living there." So this idea of living space is a problem that the Soviets actually inherited from Russia of the 19th century.
Yep.
And the urbanization that was sweeping the country at this time.
Especially in a place like Moscow or St. Petersburg, I guess then Leningrad.
Yes, it was really bad. You had people living in very tiny apartments, essentially renting out, like subletting rooms and corners of rooms even to other tenants. So, and this is such a huge influx into the urban centers that they just couldn't cope with it. Also, of course, there was money to be made, so yeah, it was a difficult situation, and early on in the Soviet era, they didn't really do much to fix it. I think starting in the 1950s, they kind of tried to turn this around.
Yeah, I mean, they had major problems with all kinds of civil engineering. Stalin had so many of the leading engineers shot because he considered them to be like Western saboteurs or some nonsense like this. So they built a whole bunch of like tunnels and bridges that didn't work or collapsed. Yeah, Soviet infrastructure was like a total disaster until Stalin died, and cooler heads and more rational heads could take power and like not shoot everybody.
So then you had these like the famous Soviet apartment complexes that sprang up in, I think, the 50s, which like all look the same. And, when everybody wants to kind of make fun of the boring blandness of Soviet cities, they usually point to those.
Those are called Khrushchevkas. They named after Khrushchev.
Right. Yeah. But that wasn't for a while yet. So this idea of the living space problem is sort of something that comes up several times in the book. But Professor Preobrazhensky is not giving up any of his 7 chambers, and he contacts the chairman of the building committee, whom he seems to do operations for. And the fear of, quote, God is put into the hearts of the committee members, and they leave with their tails between their legs. The professor doesn't like the proletariat. He does, however, love opera, particularly Aida. He's obsessed with opera and perhaps other forms of high art which are generally not favored by the proletariat. He's always singing one of the Aida arias when he works or is feeling stressed out. This chapter also contains some interesting discussion of Sharik's ability to discern things from his environment. He can practically read. First, he recognizes the colors of signs, and when he realizes that's insufficient, he comes to associate the shapes of certain letters with, for instance, meat. Speaking of food, he comments often on the diet eaten by the proletariat. And, of course, dogs, and all dogs like him. The dog will eat almost anything, sometimes with considerable relish, but he still knows the difference between good and bad food. The professor is an old landowner with old-world ideas, who's been living in this building since 1903. He laments the passing of the old good times while eating a very nice meal and drinking wine and vodka in his luxurious and large apartment with his servants and friend/protege. There's much railing against the Bolsheviks. He wishes they would stop wasting time and do their jobs properly. He's being an old curmudgeon, basically, complaining about people singing revolutionary songs at the general meeting upstairs instead of, I guess, working. He does have more general and possibly valid complaints, though. He says that the disorder caused by the revolution is causing the problems the revolution was supposed to fix in the first place. He makes the amusing analogy of someone pissing and missing the toilet, hitting the floor around it, and then complaining about the lack of hygiene. He pays his assistant, Dr. Morbenthal, handsomely, and tells him to acquire a suitable body donor. The dog, Sharik, dreams he is in a canine fairy tale, and worries that he'll wake up and be back in his miserable old existence, and shudders. He's generally well behaved, though he hates the stuffed owl for some reason, and goes to town destroying it, and is then collared. He doesn't mind, though, as it kind of shows off his privilege when the maid takes him out for walks. All's well at the house for a while, though there are ominous hints of the doctor's habit of messing about with buckets full of brains. One day, Bormenthal shows up with a bad-smelling suitcase, and the professor is very excited. Sharik gets locked in the bathroom until they are ready. He's going to be operated upon. He can tell there's guilt in the air and falseness. They knock him out with ether and start the operation. And there's some pretty graphic descriptions of slicing and bloody tissue. And the scene goes on and on. It's really quite something. Really graphic, actually.
They do this scene pretty well in the movie, I have to say.
Oh, yeah?
Really good with the practical effects.
That's pretty awesome. Did you watch the movie, Gretchen?
I did not. I didn't have the time to see that. But
yeah, I didn't watch it either, but maybe you can talk about it at the end there, Nate.
Yeah, definitely.
Give your general feelings about it. So they replace his testicles and are set to work on his brain. And they keep shooting his heart full of adrenaline. And during this time, the professor is compared to a priest. After finishing, the professor demands a cigarette and looks into the dog's eyes. Prospects for Sharik don't seem good. The professor is regretful. Now things change, and we see Bormathal's notebooks documenting what they've done and the results of the experiment, which was to replace a dog's testicles and pituitary gland with human ones, the idea being to establish the rejuvenation process. After several days, Sharik is recovering, though he has lost a lot of fur and his bones are lengthening. On New Year's Day, 1925, Sharik starts to talk and laugh. The maid is very disturbed. When the professor suffers a fainting spell and hits his head, the dog starts cursing. He wants beer and fish and is being vulgar. Things are getting out of control. Rumors getting around. They think there's a Martian on the street. He certainly does look strange, standing upright on two legs with only fur on head and chest. His genitals are manlike. The dog calls the professor's study, and maybe the professor himself, bourgeois. The swearing seems to depress the professor, who is maybe hoping for something more noble. There is talk of a pituitary gland and its power to shape the human image, which was a common belief at the time, I believe. Confirmation of the theory of evolution as well, from Dong to Mendeleev, which was kind of funny because apparently that's somebody else, but I was thinking Mendel, who was like one of the the fathers of evolutionary theory, along with Darwin.
Yeah, Mendeleev was a chemist, I think.
Yeah. Bormenthal looks upon dogs in the street with a little horror now. God only knows what could be in their brains. There's some doomsday talk, and Bormenthal has moved into the apartment now. He must sleep in reception with the dog. Bormenthal wants to psychologically elevate Sharik, but the professor thinks this unlikely to happen. You see, while Bormenthal's been studying the dog, Filip Filipovich has been studying the dead man from whom they took the organs. And he's a bad one. A balalaika player in bars named Klim Grigorievich Chugumkin. Beware guys named Klim. We know what happened with the last one. He was a bit of a rascal, too. But this one got stabbed in the heart in one of those establishments during a fight, the sort of activity he often participated in. He was tried 3 times before and sent to hard labor. "Damn it, Bormenthal!" scolded the professor. "You got me an abnormal brain!" By January 17th, the dog has turned into a short man who smokes and wears a loud tie and patent leather shoes. He still has fleas, though, and he has an aversion to cats. It seems pretty extreme. Now, Sharikov, as he wants to be called, is making noise in one of the rooms, playing the balalaika all the time and distracting the professor. The professor is a musical sort and cannot help but sing along, but hates it. And this kind of made me laugh when I read this, because it's something that I talked to my girlfriend about, and I guess she says she can't help but sing songs even when she doesn't like them. And I noticed something I kind of didn't really understand, and then I read it in this book, and I'm like, oh, is the professor has got the same problem.
Yeah.
It gets stuck in your head.
No, it does.
Yeah.
It certainly does. That catchy balalaika pub music.
Yeah. So the professor tries to put the iron grip on Sharik and tells him not to spit, swear, smoke, hang out with the ladies, sleep in the kitchen, and all that. And Sharikov is justifiably miffed. He didn't ask for this surgery business, and now the professor won't let him live. He points out he could have died under the knife. He's been hanging out with the building committee. There's a statement in the paper about the professor's illegitimate son hanging out in the apartment. But the committee actually seems to know Sharik's origins just as well as he does. The professor really, really doesn't want to be called dad, nor comrade, apparently. But Sharikov insists they are equals, and this foolish formality should stop. Sharikov is annoyed that he doesn't have any identification documents. He wants the name Polygraph Polygrafovich. So he apparently took this name from a calendar, and I didn't really understand what was meant at first, but now I think I get it. So they have these, the old tradition, which was in the Orthodox, to name your children after saints in the Orthodox calendar. So now, Sharikov also got his name from a calendar, but it's like the title page of the calendar where it lists the publishers, and Polygraph in this case probably refers to like a printing press and not a polygraph machine. So, yeah. So Polygraph and Schwander, the head of the committee, get together and force the professor to sign and make an affidavit. While they're absolutely right, there's much fuss over documents that's pretty silly. Like, there's nothing more important than documents. Sharikov won't fight in the military, he says, and the men are oddly disapproving, including Schwander, who amusingly starts to wonder if he's an anarchist. So, yeah, that's not okay, apparently. The professor doesn't want him around anymore and wants to buy a room from the building to house Sharikov, but Schwander will not have any of that. Now, the intrusion of a cat makes Sharikov kind of revert to dog type. He traps himself in the bathroom, and due to stuff getting wrecked, basically the apartment starts flooding. And all these patients keep trying to come in and demanding surgery, as well as a woman who sneaks into the kitchen and wants to get a peek at the talking dog. Everyone eventually succumbs to amusement except the professor. And they all agree, though, that Sharikov is a most obnoxious person. Of course, Sharikov has horrible table manners. He also likes vodka a lot. Interestingly, there's a vodka-quaffing cat named Behemoth in The Master and Margarita, and he's much cooler. So, I don't know. The professor and doctor seem to have something to discuss. It's all a bit mysterious. Sharikov only wants circus entertainment. And the other men say he should try the theater sometime, or maybe to read a book. And Sharikov announces, well, he has been reading. He's been reading Engels' letters, which sounds really boring. But he says the Germans should have stopped arguing and just divided everything up. And Filip Filipovich rants and rails. Bormital and Sharikov go to the circus, and Filip Filipovich smokes ceaselessly on the couch, staring at Sharikov's dog organs in a jar. Sharikov receives his documents. Schwander and the committee really just seem to be trying to help him do what needs to be done, whereas all the doctors do is berate him. Sharikov is sort of whiny and obnoxious, though, but maybe the two of them could handle the situation a little better. Sharikov seems to want attention, too, deliberately doing things to seek it, even from his two tormentors. One night, after Sharikov comes home, drunk with some strangers who steal stuff from the house, the two doctors are up late at night in the study, smoking and drinking and getting very sentimental in the Russian way. Teacher and student discuss possibly committing a horrible crime. They don't think they'll get off lightly because of their suspect family origins, judicial investigator and clerical fathers. The ethics do come up. What if it had been a genius philosopher's brain? Well, any peasant could birth a genius at any time. So what business to create one from a dog, or anything else, really? The true nature of Sharikov is the criminal from whom came his pituitary gland. An alcoholic, rascal, thief. They really don't like him. Just think of the cats! A man with a dog's heart. This says Bormenthal. But no. Filip Filipovich says the true horror is that he lacks a dog's heart. He fundamentally likes dogs, and he still thinks they can bring him up properly. But then matters are sort of taken out of their hands. Darya, the cook, shows up, dragging Sharikov, whom she refers to as Telegrafovich, who I guess tried to force himself on Zina, the maid. Sort of unfortunate. I wish that Mikhail hadn't done that, I guess, just because I think it was sort of more, I don't know, it was effective when I thought there could be some sympathy for Sharikov.
Yeah, right.
And it's kind of like, once you start sexually assaulting people, it's kind of like, yeah, well.
Yeah. I was still sort of on Sharikov's side, and then that happened, and it was like, it felt uncomfortable after that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, that's why I had conflicted feelings, right? It was like, yeah, he's kind of horrible, but I mean, he didn't really ask for any of this, right?
Mm.
So, I don't know. But we'll discuss that a little more at the end. But so Sharikov escapes, and he can't be found. And he even stole from Schwander's committee now. But wait, he went and got himself a job. He's head of the Department of Animal Control. They spend the day killing cats. Bormenthal and the professor respectively berate and manhandle Sharikov, and thunderously evaluate him and his behavior. Then he brings home a woman. She's a typist for, I guess, the building committee or something? I don't know. She's some typist. I think there's a hint that she might be a woman from early on in the book who sort of was sympathetic to the dog who'd just been burnt.
She is in the movie.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, see, that I read something about that, but I didn't think it was necessarily that obvious that it was the same person. But I guess other people concluded that it was. So, Gretchen, what do you think? Did you think it was the same person? The woman early on who kind of called, the first one to call him Sharik.
I wasn't sure. I thought that it might possibly be, but I didn't know if there was any obvious indicator that it was.
Well, I didn't pick up on that till afterwards in a reading about what people thought about the book, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, it's fine. It could be the same woman. It could not be. She doesn't really play into it too much, I guess. But the professor won't have that either, so he makes the lady feel really bad. I guess he tells her that that Sharikov is a lab experiment. One of his ways of wooing her seems to be that he convinced her that he was an ex-soldier or something, and he was wounded. And he had a singular statement that he said to her. He said, "My psyche is kind. It's only cats I hate." But again, we're not to feel sympathy for him, because when he finds out about what's happened and how she's run off, he threatens to have her fired if she doesn't go ahead with it. And it'll mean, I guess he really wants this, because it'll mean Bormenthal getting kicked out of the apartment. So it's then that one of the professor's patients shows up, and he has a document, a testimonial from Sharikov about the bad behavior of the professor and doctor, his stooge. The patient thought it was in his best interest to warn the professor. It's very disappointing all around. So finally, once again, they try to kick Sharikov out of the apartment, but he just says, "Up yours," with his middle finger, and pulls a gun. Bormenthal tackles him, and they wrestle him to the floor. And then they tell the women they're busy and not to let anyone in. Word is getting out, though, about how crazy shit is at the Preobrazhensky place nowadays. Bormental's face is all scratched up, and the professor looks like he hasn't slept or eaten in weeks. But then everything goes silent for over a week, and after 10 days, the police come to the house. Surprisingly, now, the professor seems in good health. They want to arrest him for the murder of the head of the Animal Control Sub-Department, a man named P.P. Sharikov. You mean my dog? The professor says. You think he's a man just because he speaks? Dr. Mormenthal, be so kind as to produce Sharik for the investigator, commanded Filip Filipovich, taking the arrest warrant in hand. Dr. Bormenthal grinned crookedly and left. When he returned and whistled, a dog of strange quality ran in after him through the study door. Some spots were bare. Some spots had regrown fur. He came out like a trained circus animal on his hind legs, then got down on all fours and looked around. Deadly silence congealed in the entrance, like jelly. The nightmarish dog, with a crimson scar on his forehead, got back up on his hind legs, smiled, and sat in a chair. The second policeman crossed himself with sweeping gestures, and as he moved back, stepped on both of Zena's feet. So everybody's pretty nonplussed by all this, and the professor seems victorious. Sharik is a dog again, and they can't believe he used to work in animal control. He speaks less and less these days, Filip Filipovich matter-of-factly informs the guests. He said the surgery was not a success in the end, and Sharik just reverted back to doghood. Atavism, he supplies, and the dog yells at him for using rude words. The dog is healing slowly, and starting to feel better. He calls his grandmother a slut, and doesn't care about whatever has been done to his head. Professor Preobrazhensky continues to fiddle and cut brains. Still doing the science. And that's how our story ends.
Yeah, with the dog being the winner, getting a place in the apartment like a real lucky animal.
Yeah, he certainly feels like a winner.
Yeah, and that's really all that matters, I guess.
So, where to begin tackling this thing? Like I said, I had very complicated feelings about this time around. I mean, it seems like, in a way, you have to kind of separate the ethical aspect of this book, which is kind of more in line with what we would generally consider a main line of science fiction, and the satire aspect.
Yeah, and I think the satire aspect is, first and foremost,
definitely
the style of the book. And really none of the characters in the book, except for like Zena and Daria, are good people. They all act rather reprehensibly at times.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the professor seems more like Bulgakov's type, maybe?
He does, but at the same time, he lives in like total luxury while everybody around him is in squalor. He's always treating himself to these fine, fancy meals. There's this whole issue of formality between the two of them that he insists on throughout the course of the novel. That's an issue that I think is present in the Russian language itself, where there's a case to refer to people in the formal tense that we don't really do in English anymore.
Right.
But it's definitely a sign of disrespect if you address somebody in an informal fashion that you're not close with, especially back then. And I think the professor is really insistent on these old traditional conservative ways, almost to a fault. He, I guess, is offended at the disrespect that Sharikov gives him in the beginning, and while he's just like shouting out random profanity and stuff like that. And he is adamant that he believes that the way to train an animal and a human is to not to beat them, but to give them motivation and reward. And
Yeah.
which I thought was an interesting thing to come up in the.
But all they do is they do beat him and they do
Yeah,
berate him all the time.
Yeah. So it is a kind of strange juxtaposition. I guess they feel more justified doing so in that he does become a man at some point, and he even comments that he wish he was a dog and not a man.
He does kind of imply that. I don't think he says it outright, but
Yeah,
he kind of says, like I said, he didn't ask for that.
Right.
He didn't ask. So I feel like the professor owed him a little more, I guess, leniency, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, he's like, he even resented the fact that he wanted documents, but like, how else is he supposed to be the person that he was made into? He's just trying to live.
Right. Yeah.
I find that if they could teach him how to behave, but it seems they're more interested in berating him for the way he behaves instead of trying to change him or to encourage him in any way.
Yeah, they're definitely not as patient as they could have been, considering this takes place over the course of like a couple weeks. I think his transformation to a talking person is like, what, 10 days or something like that? There's a whole chapter where they go through like the doctor's notebook, and it's a pretty cool break in the format that I like how he did.
Yeah, I like the diary excerpts.
Yeah, I like especially when it seems like they're in a state of distress and it's all jumbled words and ink blots and
yeah, and then that's the first thing that he knows, right? And it's probably both because of things he heard on the street, but also because of the way this person is. So they took the pituitary from this Grigorievich Klim character, and even though Sharikov can't seem to, I guess he doesn't remember his experiences, he basically has his personality. And he even likes to play the bow like he did, which apparently, I guess he just like picked up and sort of knew instinctively almost how to play. But, I mean, he also must have some recollection of what it was like to be a dog, and he knows what it's like to forage around in garbage cans, so it seems pretty fair of him to feel like it should all be divided up, like he said. And it seems like, like when the professor and Bormenthal are alone in a room together, Professor Preobrazhensky is like, oh no, we should be kind to him, and we can try and bring him up properly and all that. But when he actually sees Sharikov face to face, he like can't contain himself from being angry and being like outraged. And like every time Sharikov says something, he kind of blows up, right? So I mean, there's definitely some similarities to Frankenstein in the fact that yes, he's created this thing and he doesn't really want to be responsible, like properly responsible. I mean, he wants to be responsible in the sense that I guess he wants to keep him there in the apartment, but he's like, yeah, but I'm a person now, I'm a citizen. I need to have my documents. I need to work. I need to like...
He's not just an experiment.
Right. Like, and if I want to hang out with weird drunk people, I have a right to do that. Right. I mean, it sucks that they stole from the house, but,
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one element where he's criticizing both sides of the social order. The Sharikov is the new party man, a buffoon, a drunk, somebody who gets into fights all the time. He steals, he robs, but Professor and his weird doctor buddy are like these out-of-touch, greedy, and unethical experimenters who have no problem just cutting the heads open of random dogs. Because it's definitely implied this is not the first time he's done this before. So, I mean, he's just experimenting on all kinds of live animals to do who knows what. And what he creates is, it's an interesting take on the Frankenstein tale with a social element added. It's a monster he can't control, and he wants to get rid of and kill, really, as soon as he becomes too much of a problem.
Right. And again, like Frankenstein, right? He just doesn't know how to handle this situation properly. And I guess he's just doing it for science, I mean, he does seem like perhaps a kind person in there somewhere, but he only expects the world to be a certain way. And the fact is it hasn't been that way for a long time, and he's really mad about it. Eugenics is mentioned in this book. And it was something that I came across too in reading about what was happening in the background at that time, that the theories of eugenics were quite popular in the early Soviet days.
They were, yeah.
And this whole idea of the new Soviet man who's like an educated person, but with the right ideas, being like pro-Soviet ideas, and that they wanted to encourage these types of people to breed, and not the wrong types of people, essentially. So it's kind of weird because I guess like the professor who is sort of anti-Soviet is still being used as a commentary on that principle. I don't know if that entirely... I don't know. I mean, I get it because he's just driven by science, but at the same time, he kind of is against the spirit of the whole thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, eugenics and race science stuff started a little earlier than the Soviet Revolution. Like, I think it came up more in the late 1800s and stuff. So the professor is probably from that old mold. But the race and ethnicity issues in the Soviet Union are certainly complicated. It's probably more so after this time period, like more into the later Stalinist era, where he displaced hundreds of thousands of Koreans and other ethnicities just around the Soviet Union to try to quell any nationalist uprisings. So that was a serious threat to a gigantic empire like the Soviet Union, as any kind of strong, unified counter-revolutionary force. Stalin was very paranoid that one of those would take hold. But I don't think quite the professor was thinking along those particular lines. I think he's rooted in a more of a 1800s kind of race science type.
Yeah, he said he wanted to improve the race.
Yeah.
That's specifically what he said. But then he realized it was pointless. But it's, I mean, again, like it's all because he got the wrong brain, basically.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, it's again, like, he's not giving up. I mean, at the end of the book, he's still fiddling with brains, right? So he's not giving up on it, even though he kind of said, no, it's pointless. And like, it doesn't matter if we got a genius brain, like geniuses are like, what of it? We can produce them anytime, right? They can be born naturally.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But again, as artificial as it is, eugenics still implies natural reproduction. So I don't think uplifting a dog was part of the program. It does seem like that was kind of not the expected result. Like, he didn't actually expect that the dog would turn into a human. And he's like, well, that confirms the theory that this gland in the brain is that important. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how well this really works as an anti-eugenics commentary. Again, I think that sometimes we have to look more as kind of put aside all our years of sci-fi reading and look at this as a Soviet satire and see that for what it is, right? Because, I mean, they were trying to create the new Soviet man at this point. And I guess saying that, well, like, there's all kind of pithy things you could say here, like you can't teach an old dog new tricks and all that stuff, right? It's just like... But, again, like, it kind of makes you wonder if they had chosen somebody who wasn't a troublemaker, what would the results have been? But at the same time, it's also kind of nonsense, because it's like, I mean, I don't think that implanting a pituitary would do that, you know?
No.
So, there's also a lot in here about class struggle, as we sort of hinted at before.
Yeah.
The professor's an old aristocrat, and he's like struggling against the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, I mean, they pretty much turned the world order upside down, where having a background in the clergy or from any aristocratic lineage is considered to be now a very bad thing. You know, the thing that's in is the working man of the people.
I'm like, oh, Bulgakov's family left.
Yeah, right.
So he's like, I don't know, I do sort of hear him a little bit in the professor, maybe, you know, it's like he's left behind and he has to deal with this new world. And it's not been that long yet since the revolution. So, and the grip of the Soviets would get stronger yet.
Yeah, it certainly would.
But so he seems to think that the revolution itself, not only does it have temperament that goes against his nature, Bulgakov maybe thinks that it itself is a failure because he already sees a lot of corruption in the system, as evinced by the fact that Preobrazhensky seems to have this preferential treatment, and that's because he's treating members of the state. He performs some nice operations, and he gets a dining room set or something like that. And then there's the commentary of the dog. Even the dog sees that members of the proletariat, they go without good clothing in the wintertime, and they eat really poorly.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them even mistreat him more than others.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, people are not equal, as the system has tried to put forward, should be the maxim of the day. And it doesn't seem like that really improved as time went on.
No, it definitely did not. I mean, the Soviet Union definitely got more stable and like a better place to live after Stalin died. But I mean, you really didn't have the kind of freedom to speak out against the government until like the very, very end.
Right.
Right.
Long after Stalin was gone.
Oh, yeah. Like when Gorbachev opened up everything in the 80s, basically.
Glasnost and Perestroika.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But no, I mean, after Stalin died, things did get a little less chaotic with the mass executions and the terror and stuff, which, I mean, at the time, Lenin was conducting, just not to the scale that Stalin was, but it would certainly give any rational person who saw what was happening very strong cause for concern.
So speaking of Stalin again, I guess the name of this Klim Grigorievich Chugunkin, apparently Chugunkin means cast iron. And so some of the commentary that I looked at suggested that that was actually a veiled reference to Stalin, which of course means steel.
Yeah.
Yeah. An interesting thing about Stalin too is the complicated relationship that Mikhail Bulgakov and Stalin had. And one thing I didn't cover was that after this initial phone call, Mikhail wrote Stalin many letters. I don't think he ever got a personal response back again. He certainly never received a phone call, and they never met in person. But his attitude about it was very strange. A lot of his writing has to do with someone fighting against, I guess, autocracy and being sort of struggling against, being silenced, essentially. And yet, he seems like he himself was fascinated by autocrats. And in many of his works, like The Master and Margarita, he does not portray them as villains. And Stalin himself, he wrote him all these letters, and he even at one point, although he didn't send this letter, but this was found in his papers, he had asked him at one point to be his first reader. But then he didn't send the letter, and according to one of the contributors to the book, Mikhail Bulgakov, Novelist and Playwright, which is a pretty good series of essays about him and his work, he was speculating about some of the past relationships between artists and dictators and how badly things went. And maybe that's why he didn't send the letter. And he's like, this it's too much. I can't do this, right? But funnily enough, though, the last play that Mikhail worked on was actually a play about the young Stalin. And it was a play called Batum. And this play was never produced. It was possibly done to form because it was Stalin's 60th birthday, and they were going to have this big celebration. And he had apparently been talking about writing this play for many years, and in 1939 he finally did. This was a year before he died. And Stalin looked at the play, because apparently he read a lot of the plays before they were produced, if they were ever produced. And he looked at the play, and he is reported to have said, "All young people and children are alike. There is no need for a play about the young Stalin." And so the play didn't happen. And it seems like a lot of scholars agree that it's not one of Mikhail's best efforts. He does have an interesting scene where the young Stalin is getting beaten up by police. And he kind of says something. He's like, "And this is for everything," right? And it's like, wow, you're. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think that Stalin was certainly not ashamed of the fact that he used to get in a lot of scraps with authority figures, because that was part of his thing, right, early on. I mean, Stalin himself went to school in a seminary. He was supposed to be training to be a priest.
Right.
And, well, he did not get along well with any of the teachers, let's put it this way. Physical altercations were apparently common. So, and then, yeah, police, I mean, you know, he became radicalized and became a revolutionary. So, I don't know, it's just interesting. He put that in the mouth of one of the old police guards, you know, he's like, and that's for everything, right? Like, you're not just a nuisance, you're the big nuisance, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just like, kind of this weird love-hate relationship they had going on, almost. So there are a few adaptations of this, as well as the movie, which I think Nate will talk about in a bit. There's another film with Max von Sydow as the professor, which is the Italian version from the 70s.
Yeah.
There's also a couple of operas and a few different theatrical play productions. It's interesting that it seems to have been made into an opera 2 or 3 times, different operas.
Yeah, I'm not really into the contemporary opera scene, but it's kind of
Me
neat.
neither.
Philip Filipovich might be proud of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the film they made in the late 80s, 1988, in the Soviet Union of this is a very, very faithful adaptation of the work.
It's a very popular film as well.
It is, yeah.
In the Soviet, in Russia, yeah.
Yeah, but the casting is really good for all the roles. Pretty much a lot of the dialogue is from the original text. There's not too much they changed. There's like 2 minor scenes where Bormenthal and the typist are making eyes at one another, but again, it's very brief. They don't have any dialogue with one another. It's just like a kind of couple seconds on the screen, and it's like, oh, that's interesting.
Maybe that explains why Bormenthal was so mad.
Yeah.
so like,
Yeah.
yeah.
But it was really well done film. Definitely couldn't have been made in the 60s when it broke in the English world, certainly after Gorbachev opened everything up by 1988. That kind of film was, I guess, appropriate and acceptable to make, or at least acceptable enough where it wouldn't get you in trouble with the film censors and the party and all of that, because it definitely does keep all of the satirical elements of the revolution and the early Communist Party in there.
Yes, just a few years away, 1991 is not only the fall of the Soviet Union, but Bulgakov's centenary.
Right.
And they had a huge celebration. It was a really big deal, apparently. In the 1950s, Bulgakov was practically completely unknown. And then somehow between the late 60s and the late 80s, he just kind of blew up and became a real cult figure and a really respected writer in Russia. Something amusing I thought of actually asking if you could find Nate, but I think it was the May 1991 issue of Crocodile, which is a satirical newspaper of some kind. They actually put out a Mikhail Bulgakov crossword puzzle. And all the across clues were for Master and Margarita, and the down clues were for Dog's Heart.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should look for that.
If anybody has any other thoughts on this one.
Other than, I thought it was an interesting read, and I do look forward to trying more Bulgakov in the future.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely.
I think Bulgakov is certainly an interesting figure. A little bit contradictory, maybe, in some ways. Kind of fascinating in that. Gretchen, you say you actually found a book, a fiction book, with Bulgakov as a character the other day, right?
Yeah, at the book sale I was at, I found it was called Mikhail and Margarita, and it was described as a love triangle between Bulgakov, a secret police officer, and I think it was a fierce and rebellious Margarita. And I did pick it up. I was curious. It seemed like fate that I should at least check it out. So
that's very good timing.
If I get to it soon, I'll have to let you both know how it is.
Yeah, definitely.
It sounds like a kind of a steamy romance thriller or something like that.
Yeah.
Margarita herself was actually supposed to be based on Mikhail's third wife, Yelena. But who knows how they jigger that in the book. Maybe Margarita and Yelena are the same person, right? So
yeah.
they get married. I don't know. But yeah, like they did marry in 1932, I think, so plenty of time for them to get to know each other and get mixed up with the secret police and everything, right? So, all right. Well, now we've been talking about essentialism, and we've been talking about the power of the pituitary gland. But perhaps it's now time to move on to somewhat more abstract topics.